I guess I was a biologist by birth, and I came out the womb kicking and screaming and crawling for the muddy, slick, spiny, slimy, wet, feathered and winged and scaled places, and pretty hard to keep me out of wetlands and such. And so I don't actually have a sense of what drew me there, but that was the deep passion within that I followed unrelentingly, and then just figured out how to make a living out of it.
What are your passions now that you're working on?
I think my primary passion is really a process of attempting to mitigate the cerebral imperviousness of a society that is basically in need of dramatic ecosystem restoration. And so, in essence, I feel like I'm a bit of a biological therapist in trying to help societal transformation return back to a path that is more in keeping with engendering a future for a planet that we would be proud to give to our future generations.
What do you think is wrong with us? I mean, why are we living out of step with nature, and why are we so ego-driven?
It strikes me that humans have this apart from fallacy versus a part of, and it's not all humans, because indigenous cultures, many of them didn't have that, but our modern post-Descartes reductionist, myopic, compartmentalized scientific world has this separation anxiety, this bipolar thing that's happening, and somewhere we lost track, and there's a bunch of, I guess, points and diversions on the path where we lost track, but it began some thousands of years ago, I think, in the sense that the planet was a commodity instead of a community, and that we were somehow superior to this place versus intrinsically interdependent with it.
Can you talk more about the departure? At what point, and what was what were the forces? Was it agriculture, or what was it that pulled us away?
And any points that you see worsening?
It's been such a gradual transformation in many respects. You could look back to the Sumerians in the Fertile Crescent of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, or the early Phoenicians, the Cypriots, but systematically those Mediterranean cultures, as they grew in population and in the consolidation of their resources, and thus the consolidation of their communities in hierarchical power structures that allowed for stratification in the society, where certain people began to specialize, and in their specialization they lost feedbacks of their behavior in a manner that disenfranchised them from being connected to place, and thus they began making decisions that resulted in collapsing carrying capacities in places, so that they clear-cut the watersheds and denuded them, and that desertification paradigm of deforestation resulted in the end collapse of the civilization. But there was not enough wisdom within the intelligentsia of that society to respond fast enough. And so time and again we've seen culture after culture, civilization more importantly, I think, go extinct, if you will, or resume its rightful place at a lesser scale. And our modern civilization is at the pinnacle of that instability, and on a precipice to actually continue that trend of collapse.
Can you talk about that more, about where we are right now and use of resources, and are we maxing out the biosphere's carrying capacity? And
yeah, I think that the sacred break that really catapulted our modern civilization into this precipice was when we began becoming dependent on death as our medium for fueling our future. And that is that as we became dependent on fossil fuels, or more astutely understood to be fossil fools, that those are sequestered carbon that was put away in the ground millions of years ago of plant bodies. And there's a living cycle of solar energy on the planet, and hydrologic cycle, that if you're living in a place that has regenerative capacity, you're living in the life cycle part of things. And when you started feeding off of the fossil fuel cycle, we became living with a death-based cycle. And that death cycle of dependency on extraction of those resources set in motion a sequence of events that has led us to our modern crisis of global disturbance known as climate change or global warming, if you will. And it's that addicts don't typically die because the drug runs out, i.e. peak oil when the drug runs out isn't what will drive the death. It's really going to be that the organism, the body, lacks the capacity to sequester the byproducts of the toxin or drug that's being used, i.e. your liver gives up or your lungs give up if you're an alcoholic or a smoker. In the case of the planet, it's the byproducts of burning fossil fuels and the impact of the atmosphere and the retention of heat, and that's really driving this. It's a destabilization of a planetary system that had integrity and resilience, although very dynamic, and we're just amplifying that disturbance.
Why do you think, knowing that a lot of people do know that and we must know subconsciously that we're disturbing the planet and the biosphere, which is the way we live, and it is somewhat of a suicidal tendency. Why are we so suicidal, and can we pull back, and how can we pull back from the edge?
Why are we so suicidal? It's an interesting question. I think that the suicide at some level is a very personal act that you make a choice and you do that intentionally. And it's not clear to me that the individuals in the society have that tendency, but the aggregated expression of our behavior is unwittingly resulting in a collective suicide that no individual has a sense that they're actually performing or involved with. And I guess there's a sense there's that West denial virus, I would say, is what we're up against, that the West is in denial of the relationship it has or should have. And that makes sense, that West coming out of Europe, and that Western Europe was so densely populated and has gone through so much tumultuous change through time. And then the diaspora of those people colonizing the New World or other continents and bringing with them this sense that they were engaged in a degenerative relationship with the land as opposed to a regenerative, reciprocal, and reverential relationship with place. And religion, centralized, dogmatic religion, for me personally, appears to be significantly implicated in that disconnection.
How can we pull back? Do you think we can in time?
I think that if we understand the notion of peak oil, that with respect to production of oil, and that our production globally will peak, and we understand the dependency of our entire infrastructure and energy and transport and commercial capacity, when that begins to no longer be so, quote, cheap in quotes, because the true cost pricing of climate change should be reflected in a gallon of gasoline, for instance, which it is not, the question, and I think David Holmgren, who's a permaculture designer in Australia, calls it creative descent. And our generation has the blessing and the bane to live at the peak of the oil curve. And we have the vision to stand on the top of this peak and survey the descent down into a new valley of the future with respect to energy, and how creatively we can make that descent lesser as far as how steep it is. It can be very steep and it can go very deep, or we can ease it off, and that's really a question for society at large to adapt to the change that is already underway. It's not as if somehow in the future climate change will occur. It's well underway, and our creativity in recognizing and adopting early things that will help us certainly reduce the contribution of fossil fuels and products in the atmosphere is the first step, but the juggernaut is already unleashed. The game then becomes is how do we derive solutions that allow us to become resilient in the face of a very dynamically changing time. And that's where I think we have a bit of a conundrum, because we have at our most upper levels of decision making in our supposed democracy a set of people that are absolutely unable to see before them the crisis that their addictive behavior is driving the system towards. And that's the biggest concern I have, I must admit, is again that there's this ecosystem that is just out of control. It literally is out of control. And science is out of control if you understand science to be a methodology of decision making and discernment that requires controls so that you can contrast and compare. And on this planet, there are no intact ecological systems left upon which you can use them as a control to compare what was and what could be. And so it's out of control.
Can you talk about the creative path down in permaculture? What is permaculture? And we need to know all about it.
What is permaculture?
Yeah.
Permaculture is in essence a design science that really is attempting to understand how do we redesign human settlement patterns in a manner that creates the conditions conducive for coexistence. And thus every human endeavor that we do, transportation, farming, agriculture, education, industry, religion, finance, everything we work on must be designed in a way where the byproducts of that design result in a feed for the next part of the cycle. There's a design mantra called waste equals food. Bill McDonough speaks of this very eloquently. And the idea that waste equals food, and if you're designing a system where the waste from your system is deleterious to the next part of the cycle, it's degradative, it's destructive, then you are once again based on a death design. And thus the question I think is it an antibiotic-based plan or a probiotic-based plan? And a probiotic future, the true pro-life future that permaculture attempts to support us in understanding, is really a rethink based on a set of principles that start with care of earth, care of people, and distribution of surplus. And that there's a plenty of abundance on this planet. We live on a planet that the hallmark in the universe of planet Earth, planet water more appropriately, is abundance. And once you get that and you see abundance, then you can have your buns dance with the fecundity of that recognition versus a sense that the planet is based on scarcity, where you're scared in the city, clinging with fear. All right? Are you afraid or do you feel the fecundity of what the future could hold? And that's a perceptual conundrum. And at this moment in time, people, I think, lack access by design, by certain, Noam Chomsky would talk about the manufacturing of consent, and people lack access to information that will help them see that there are options for a sustainable future. And sustainable is an interesting term. I think we should, if I asked you, is your relationship sustainable? And you said, oh yes, my wife and I have a sustainable relationship. It sounds a little kind of static, right? We want a regenerative future because we have to make up for many generations of lost time here, the complete conversion and clear cut of forests and loss of wetlands and riparian extinction of species. We've got to make up, so it can't just be sustainable. We have to see a regenerative future, and permaculture design is looking at how do we have buildings that can, in the process of the extraction of the materials and the building of them, be regenerative for the landscape upon which they sit and they nest within, and how can they produce their own energy, produce their own water, clean their own waste, and have that waste feedback. And so we're really looking at this set of principles in permaculture that are design principles, ideas of we call stacking functions, where you look to a design element to yield for you more than just one function, that they're in relative location, that there's a synergistic feedback, that we create the interconnections of a system so that the great ecological mantra is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And there's something about those emergent properties that this greater whole, this Gaianistic realm, if you will, of James Lovelock's word for the Greek goddess of earth, Gaia, this living, respiring, metabolizing, breathing, incredibly symbiotic entity that in the presence of life has begotten more life on this planet. It's a feedback that has engendered more complexity because it's intrinsically cooperative versus competitive. And the survival of the fittest mantra came out of Spencer, who was a social Darwinist, justifying the expansion of the imperial British Raj, if you will, that the sun never sat on the empire. It's competition or is it cooperation? And there's a little bit of each, but we believe it appears, or some people profiteering from the perception of competition, continue to foist that fallacy upon our society to the detriment of the future. So permaculture is really trying to pragmatically design. So what the Bioneers Conference, the speakers at the Bioneers Conference, the work of John Todd and the Living Machines is an incredible component of how we might deal with the use of plants and wastewater. Paul Stamets and his mushroom understandings, the work that David Orr and his building at Oberlin College has done, the watershed work that we see, the watershed restoration, the ecological literacy movement. I would support you in recognizing that at this time, we are the most ecologically illiterate civilization that the planet has ever known. And ecological illiteracy is the gravest epidemic we face on this planet. And until we re-engage and become literate in the landscape of place and people from where we come, we will continue to behave as if we don't live there and don't deserve to live there. And that's a process of re-indigenation and reclaiming a space that is infused with justice for all species in that place. But until we get that, and so the permaculture thing understands that underlying, maybe you perceive it as a philosophical situation, and then pragmatically comes up with solutions. How do we do agriculture that builds soil versus destroys soil? How do we do agriculture that yields clean water and clean air and increased biodiversity and magic for children? That's a design question. We can do that and have it be economically viable. Economy is a subset of ecology, as is everything. And in that regard, economy is just the expression of our design and our aspiration. And we can design economic systems that breed a future that does not have to destroy the carrying capacity of the planet. But it's going to take the will of the people, and it has to move back into a solar-based system, solar-powered system that within the living solar cycle, where we are living based on the photosynthesis of the planet and how that energy is transformed and sequestered and moved forth, not sequestered solar energy with the fossil fuels. That's a death-based path. And the question then I think becomes is, can we invest in solar energy and solar power? And I would support you that if you think about that, the most important solar energy to invest in, I would spell SOULAR. That's the solar power of our souls to come to the table and attempt to step up to this plate and move forward in a manner that's regenerative.
In terms of whole ecosystems, how about, I'd like to talk about media a little bit, and why do you think we're not getting the right feedback from our media and the culture in which we read paper and watch television, and how are we going to get past that sort of information block?
How do we reclaim the weapons of mass deception? Great question here. It's a political conundrum and a democracy question, because when corporations have assumed that they, under the 14th Amendment, which gave freed black slaves certain rights, that corporations also asserted that they were now called persons and they got personhood status. And free speech then is a right of a person in our Constitution, and the use of money to manipulate a system is held by the Supreme Court as an expression of free speech. And thus, those with the money can then empower themselves to manufacture consent again towards driving a design that increases the efficacy of their return on investment, if you will. And thus, media, like politics, as long as it continues to be fueled by a subset of people who perceive that greed is the greatest good, we have a very long challenge before us. And freedom is an interesting question. We hear that on the media a lot, freedom. And what I'm fascinated again in looking at language and linguistics is that freedom, as far as I can tell, how it's spelled in the mind's eye of George Bush, is F-R-E-E-D-U-M-B, freedom. And we're getting a free, dumb nation that believes that it actually doesn't have the authority. And that isn't about we the people, the true people, not the corporate person. And until we reclaim a sense of that sovereignty, that we have the ability to move forward in setting the agenda that reclaims our connection and our communities and our lives, and tells the media that we actually don't wish for them. They're not providing a service that is valued in the society by the means that they're currently doing it, which I think are promoting this ecological illiteracy. There's a vacuous hole in the media around access to information that would enhance the ecological literacy of society at this time. And I personally don't own a television, and I haven't owned a television as I've been an adult. I don't watch TV. I watch videos, and I watch really good movies made by ethical people. I have chosen to remove myself from that form of brainwashing because it's really a washing of your brain. And I'm a watershed restoration person, and watershed restoration begins in the headwaters of watersheds, in the initial incipient places where water begins. But I would support you in recognizing that the most important headwaters to work with is actually the water in your own head, which our heads should be most 70 or 80% by volume water. And that's a critical piece to understand, is how do we mitigate cerebral imperviousness and get it in our brains, in our bodies, in our hearts, in our spirit, that it's a selfish endeavor at this moment to get clear that, is Gaia going away? Nah. Is the carrying capacity for a human population that's happy and healthy in a future going away? Absolutely. And it's not about saving the planet. It's about saving a carrying capacity, a system upon which humans can live in the pursuit of happiness. That's what's at stake. And maybe there's too much stake in the system and it should be at tofu, but that's another question. Bad puns.
That one.
Edit that one
Do you want to get the freedom
Great.
thing again with the motorcycle or not?
I think we're okay.
Okay.
The motorcycle, wow.
Yes, there's more. There's a lot there. I want to go back to permaculture again and watershed, but before, because you brought up so many things.
And there's some water.
Yeah, you want some
There's water right here. Got some there?
Speaking of water.
There's a clean, fresh one here if you want.
Yeah, I trust you.
Okay.
How bad is it, in your opinion? I mean, how much of a problem are we facing, and what are the drivers, the key drivers? You know, I want to know what, when you say we're in trouble, what do you mean by that? And can you draw us a picture of what that may look like, what the trouble is?
I think the key drivers in the crisis we're facing start from, at a social political level, from the hubris of a current political structure that is absolutely unable to see it, the extent to which it's promulgating its own demise. So there's that political piece. The way in which I see that expressed in the world, in the natural history of the world, being a biologist who, for the most part, has spent my career working on endangered species. And I'm the character out in the slimy wetlands at midnight with a headlamp finding the last frog. And it's those canaries in the coal mine, if you will, the extinction of species worldwide, the loss of perennial forest cover, the melting of the Antarctic ice shelf, the shelves that have been collapsing in the Antarctic, the Arctic ice shelf, which is reducing in size, the melting of the permafrost, the loss of those lakes, the expansion of species, the incredible increase in hurricanes, in typhoons, in when fires happen, when they come through landscapes that are overstocked with fuel. What we see is that the disturbance regimes, ecology has always been driven by disturbance, in the sense that there's this idea of succession, and systems are adapting to change through time. And we have just amplified the intensity of disturbances. And so hurricanes are natural, but 5-class hurricanes, or what we'll see 6s, those are they an act of God, or to the extent that you believe that humans in their creation of the system that's yielded that disturbance is God? It's really an act of human expression of our place on this planet. So it strikes me that what I see then is the potential for disease, which is incredible, the implication for water, which is something I'm most interested in, is the future droughts of what will be coming with climate change in many areas, the flooding that will accompany many places, that we are making the planet less hospitable by either drying it up or making it too wet or burning it or whipping you with winds or tornadoes. It's not the cozy little comfy spot that it had been that we've grown up with as a species for the last roughly 5,000 years. And that, unfortunately, that creative descent down the peak oil curve, we have to figure out as we head towards the bottleneck is what is the slope of that curve. And we can restore watersheds, we can honor them as places to capture water, we can replant forests, we can educate communities, we can reduce our dependence on external inputs and fossil fuels, we can grow food locally and organic in season instead of depending on average food coming 1,500 miles away to your plate, grown on some land with toxic chemicals and toxic pesticides that eroded the soil, that were shipped in refrigerator trucks with CFC coolants and packaged in plastic wrap with PVC and cancer clusters where that wrap was made, and cardboard from old growth forests that were turned into paper. And that whole system is a death-based design, living at appropriate bioregional scales and producing your water, your food, your energy, your community at a local level, at a regional level. And this isn't an anti-globalization thing at all. We want to feed the world locally, and that can be done. But until we get there politically, it appears that there will be significantly less people in the coming century than what we currently have now. And that's a tough pill to swallow. And the injustice of how that will play out, it will be equally disconcerting. And it may even feel depressing, that you feel depressed about that, which is a valid emotion. The question then becomes is, do you wish to just succumb to the depression and thus capitulate your capacity to that, and then thus you give in and they get what they want, they being this inexorable system driving towards death? Or we can stand up and fight like a peaceful warrior in a way for what we do want. We can ask ourselves, what do we want? And we need to put out fires metaphorically, but we also need to build the example, the living demonstrations, and make those happen. And I live on an intentional community. I own land with 11 people on an 80-acre parcel. It's a consensus-based collective. You could call it a hippie commune. And we share chores and cooking and cleaning and all of our finances. And it's a radical endeavor to reclaim community connection with people that engenders our tenure on land towards an intergenerational succession of caregiving in place. That's, as far as I can tell, the most radical thing we can do is reclaim community, reclaim your connection to the people that you live with, whether it's an urban scale, a suburban or rural scale, at every scale independently. The fragmentation of our connection with others is the loss of our humanity. And at that point, it's challenging to figure out what we have left if we no longer trust ourselves. Who do we trust? And as far as who some people trust, and there are folks that believe in the rapture, I'm all about bring the rapture on. So those folks who believe can leave the planet, and the rest of us who love this planet can get on with the good work of incredible, beautiful blue and green and brown and white spiraling orb that we inhabit, the most miraculous of places. Well, imagine what we live on is planet water. And if you look at that beautiful Apollo image of the planet, known as planet Earth by most, it was mostly blue, but it had these white swirly gaseous clouds. It had these white caps on either end that were solid. So it has this oceanic saline solution that was 70% of the planet is water in its liquid form, and then its ice solid form and its gaseous form. And there's the hydrologic cycle. Imagine the hydrologic cycle. You're a piece of your water in the ocean, and you evaporate And in that process, you leave all your salts and pollutants behind. You become pure H2O, and you form a cloud with a bunch of your friends. And you get to then move over the land or the ocean and rain down again as snow or fog or rain itself, and redistribute this incredible pure substance upon which all life depends. When life is metabolizing actively by volume, it is always mostly water. So water is the fundamental element of life. It's the lubricant of life. It's the elixir. It drives all metabolic processes. You can't think, move, take in air, digest, have muscle tissue. You can't speak. You can't do anything unless water facilitates that neural pathway, that digestive process, that physiological process. Water is intrinsically engaged with the presence of life. So I would support all of you in staying hydrated. As a baby, you're 80% plus water. As you get older, you become less water. Death is a function of dehydration. And the fountain of youth that Ponce de Leon was looking for is actually in a glass of water, and you should all stay hydrated. Americans are chronically dehydrated, and there are many diseases and disorders associated with that. Now, the thing we get to think about with water then is that the entire planet, due to geology, plate tectonics, earthquakes, uplift, and the hydrologic cycle, which creates erosion, think of the Grand Canyon, there's been a dynamic dialogue between earth processes and hydrologic processes that have sculpted and carved three-dimensional cradles, containers, vessels everywhere on the planet, and they're known as watersheds, drainages, basins, catchments, many names. If you cup your hands together and you look at them, the perimeter around your fingers would be like the watershed divide, and the rivulets between your fingers is actually the little creeks that meet at the main stem where your ad-pressed palms come together at the mouth of the watershed, where you should drink pure water. How many of you trust a creek enough to get on your hands and knees and dip your hands into it and drink at the mouth of your articulated wrists of the watershed? Very few of us. That is a crisis. So the crisis that we live in watersheds where we behave through our land use to a point where the principal measure of how we live on the land, to paraphrase a quote of Luna Leopold's, is that our water, the health of our waters, if they're pure and clean, we're doing a good job. If they're polluted and dirty, it is efficaciously telling us we are not doing very well. And so water is the most truthful thing you can find on the planet. It is either clean and there's plenty of it, or there's not enough and it's polluted. And how we engage with that is interesting. And it's at the watershed scale, because everyone on the planet lives in a watershed. There's no exception to that. And then where you live in that watershed, and what is your relationship to every act you do on a daily basis? Does it support the health of the water or not? Your home, your parking lot, that playground, that ball field, wherever you work is in a watershed. Most people can't see the watershed for the creek, and they think that they should go to the river to think about the watershed. So watersheds define for us the ultimate boundaries of how we should think about community from an ecological perspective. And then we get to live within them. But if we behave in a manner that trashes them, that we don't trust the water, then what do we trust? We tend to increasingly trust water that is given to us in a bottle. And we believe in this fetish, this fallacious fetish of filtration, where I don't have to care about the watershed because I'm going to filter my water in a bottle and I'll just drink it. So I'm now disconnected from how agriculture happens or how urban stormwater works in a watershed because I trust that I can just filter it. And I don't need to get water from the watershed because I can dam a river up somewhere else, 1,000 miles away, the Colorado River that feeds Los Angeles or the east side of the Sierras. I no longer have to live within my watershed. And when you break the bond of connection to place with respect to water, you begin a process where you are now living literally outside of the bounds of where you live, where the place that defines where you live. And at that moment, you have commenced a very slippery slope towards a degradation design that comes out of desiccation. And our development is a desiccation, degradation-based design. We clear cut forests, we plow up land, we pave it over. Remember that water droplet? So it should have rained down on a forest and become a redwood tree for 1,000 years and then maybe evapotranspired and picked up as a cloud to rain down and be in the soil and not return to the ocean for 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years. Instead, that raindrop lands on asphalt. Whose ass is at fault for that stuff we're not going to talk about. But it goes into a curb, into a gutter, into a storm drain, in a pipe, and out to the ocean with a bunch of cigarette butts with it 2 days later instead of 1,000 years later. And as we pave over and compact the land, we short circuit the hydrologic cycle. And we have this incredible process where we no longer allow the water to infiltrate into the land, to soak back in, to rehydrate the aquifers, the springs, or flow to the creeks. And so we dehydrate that. But increasingly, we demand more water from the ground through groundwater wells, but we're not putting water in because we paved over the recharge. So it's in essence like saying Gaia gives you an allowance every year based on the rainfall of wherever you live. It's your allowance, it's your income. And then you have a means by which you make deposits in the savings account, groundwater in this case, but you're no longer making those deposits, but you continue to write checks on the account. So you're withdrawing, i.e. turning the faucet on from the groundwater pump, but you're not putting any money in the bank. And what happens is hydrologic bankruptcy. And it's fine to file Chapter 11 when you're talking money, but watersheds don't do Chapter 11. They just dry up. And so we have a hydrologically illiterate civilization. And the Army Corps of Engineers, who believes that the path of least resistance of water is a straight line trapezoidal cement channel, think of the Los Angeles River, and they move that water straight out. If you think of New Orleans, imagine the Mississippi watershed. 40% of the North American continent, of all the surface water that runs off the continent, goes out the mouth of the Mississippi at the delta. And you straight lined that channel so that the river flows so fast that when it hits the mouth at the Gulf there, the sediment gets pushed off of the continental shelf and it can't accumulate and make what they call the alluvial fan, the delta. And so then it begins eroding, but you're taking water out of the system and the area is sinking roughly 5 feet. Every 100 years, the land is subsiding, which means the ocean's coming in more, and you're not building up a delta, and you've clear-cut the coastal systems, so the water gets to come further and further in, and you build a city that's 20 feet below the river level and put walls on it. That is the greatest expression of our time of how ecologically, hydrologically illiterate the society we live in. New Orleans will always be faced with that. The people of New Orleans don't deserve that, right? It's not their fault. It's a process where we have a culture that doesn't understand the value of water. So water then gives us an opportunity where we can move into a place where we can have a reverential relationship that rehydrates and honor water, and we can do stormwater designs that slow water down, spread the water out, and sink the water back in the land. We can reclaim the pollutants. Imagine every 8 months in the lower 48, 10.9 million gallons of oil runs off of parking lots and roads in rainstorms from just the drippings from the oil pan. 10.9 million gallons happens to be how much oil Exxon Valdez spilled in Prince William Sound. So there's an Exxon Valdez every 8 months in the lower 48 from oil running off our roads and our parking lots. Well, does that have to happen? Well, we could change some things about our vehicles. But we could also make those parking lots, which has been happening all over the country, Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, Maryland, parking lots that drain the water not into a pipe, but into a beautiful sunken bed of soil and carbon and plants and fungus and bacteria, and waste becomes food. And the fungus takes that hydrocarbon, fossil fuel, carbons with hydrogen atoms attached, and they clip that hydrogen-carbon bond and they get energy and they feed off of that waste. And it's been proven, especially by Paul Stamets's work, that fungus can break that down to its elemental components and turn waste into food to feed a living, beautiful, healthy system adjacent to that parking lot that's now greener and healthier and full of birds and butterflies, a nicer place to be, cleans the water, the salmon aren't being polluted. So it's a design change. It's a perceptual change. We can redesign these systems if we believe in how important it is to do that on our own behalf. Again, that's a societal question. Are we compelled to do it? Do we feel connected enough to honor that? And I think there's nothing like water to build connection, because it is really the lubricant of life. It interconnects us all. And the bottled water thing as well is the epitome of fragmentation and disconnection. Many of you may have purchased bottles of water. Maybe you bought a quart of water from some store. That quart cost you $1, $2. I recently saw a bottled water from Norway for $3.25 a quart. All of you are smart people. You can do the math. 4 quarts in a gallon. That's $13 a gallon for bottled water shipped in some sort of container from Norway so you can drink it. We're in a country right now fighting to steal a resource from them called Iraq with their oil to keep gasoline prices at less than $2 to $2.50 a gallon while people pay $13 a gallon as that material is brought here on the very resource, the fossil fuels, of a ship. It's a ludicrous and suicidal design. But if we don't trust our local water, what do we trust? And I would support us that in water we trust. That would be, which path do you perceive? Is it a commodity or a community? Are you on the oil path or the water path? Because oil and water don't mix. Are you on a death-based path or a life-based path? The two are intrinsically engaged. Is it all about humility or hubris? Do you impose upon the planet or do you compose with the planet? It's a stance that we all make. And Archimedes talked about, give me a place to stand and a lever big enough and I can move the world. And I support you in taking a stand for a planet that is healthy. Take that stand. Use the lever of your knowledge to leverage the political, social, economic, spiritual change, and then convince as many people as you can to pull on that lever together, and we can move the world. We can do it, but it's going to take all of us. And water is going to be the lubricant that helps us fuel that capacity because it's the fundamental element. From water, we can then do soil. From that, we can grow plants. From that, life and birds and animals and people can grow. And we're dependent on water in ways that are unfortunately misunderstood continually.
I'm just going to ask you our final question because that was really incredible. I mean, the whole metaphor of water is just
Wonderful.
Isn't that fun?
Intensely beautiful. Do you want to say anything?
I'm listening.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything that we're not covering, but I'm going to ask?
I guess the most telling thing that I would like to say to them would be that, and it's really not my words at all, they're the words of Oren Lyons, who is an Onondaga elder of the Iroquois Confederacy, and so he's speaking for his people who brought us the idea of 7 generations. And he says, what you people, white, Eurocentric, Western culture, what you people call your natural resources, our people call relatives. And so there's the theory of relativity, if you will. And I think many of us are kinesthetic learners. We like to move and do. But the most important thing of being a kinesthetic learner is that we understand and honor and revere the aesthetics of being kin on a living planet. Well, that was extemporaneous, right?
That was great.
And so I welcome all of you to bring to bear the best you can for your basin of relation.